The wheat scale ledger would weigh 4 pounds 11 ounces before noon, too heavy for paper, and the water deed was somehow inside it. The padlock on the grain shed had rusted shut sometime between her father's funeral and the 3rd week of October, and Verena Rothmeyer had to lean her full weight against the steel door before it cracked open in a breath of stale wheat dust and old motor oil that smelled exactly the way her childhood had smelled. She stood for a moment, with one hand still on the latch, listening to the November wind move through the dead Milo across the section line, and asked the empty shed the question she had not been able to ask anyone aloud since the burial. Where did Anton Rothmeyer keep his books? Not the parish ledger he had kept for St. Fidelis for 30 years. Not the wheat checks, the other books, the ones he had told her 3 weeks before he died, were the only thing she needed to find if anyone ever came around asking about the water. Verena pressed her thumb against the small amber cross at her throat, the way she always did before a hard answer, and stepped inside. The shed was 30 feet by 60, plate steel siding, dirt floor packed harder than concrete. Along the north wall stood the platform scale her grandfather Conrad had bought new from a Topeka scale works in 1936, a black iron weighing beam still set to 70 pounds, and a brass dial that had been polished by 68 winters of her father's left hand. Beside the scale was the office, if a man could call 6 feet of plywood partition an office. One steel drawer cabinet, one wooden stool, one calendar from the Victoria State Bank. October still showing. Her father had died on the 3rd of October, and the calendar had not turned. She crossed to the drawer cabinet and tried the top drawer, and it slid open on a complaint of old grit. Pencils, a pocket knife with a bone handle she remembered from when she was 9 years old, sitting on the same stool, watching her father sharpen a pencil over a wheat check. A tin of saddle soap. Nothing she would ever take to Hans Dreiling in town and call evidence. She tried the second drawer. Receipts. 3 decades of grain receipts in rubber-banded bundles, the rubber gone tacky and split. She lifted them out one bundle at a time and set them on the platform scale, and they shifted under their own weight, and one bundle slumped, and a yellowed paper slid out and settled at her feet, and when she stooped to pick it up, she saw it was a 1989 co-op receipt for 42 bushels of Milo at $2.15, and her father's small square handwriting at the bottom. "Pay the priest first, Lord. The rest of us can wait." She held the receipt in her hand for a long time. Then she put it back in the bundle and tried the third drawer. The third drawer fought her. It came out an inch and stopped, and she rocked it side to side, and finally something inside thumped and shifted, and the drawer slid all the way open, and there it was. A black ledger book the size of a family Bible, brass corner guards on all 4 edges, cloth cover gone soft, and oil darkened along the spine. The binding loose enough at the top edge that she could see the threads where the cloth had been resewn, at least twice. She did not pick it up. She stood looking down at it, the way a woman looks at a thing she has been waiting 40 years to find, without ever quite knowing she was waiting. Then she lifted it out, two-handed, and the unfamiliar weight pulled at her wrists. Too heavy for paper. Heavier than a ledger book ought to be. She carried it across the shed and laid it on the platform scale, and the brass needle swung slow and stopped at 4 pounds 11 ounces. A ledger book this size should not weigh 4 pounds. 11 ounces. Her father had told her 3 weeks before he died, sitting on the front porch in the late summer, with his hands folded in his lap and the wheat already cut and bagged behind them. Verena, there is going to come a time when somebody from a company with a name nobody has ever heard of is going to come down this lane and offer your cousin Reinhardt good money for the water. And your cousin is going to take it because Reinhardt has never understood that water is not the same thing as land. You find Grandpa Conrad's old wheat scale book before that happens. The water is in the book, not on it, in it. She had laughed then. She had thought he was making one of his Volga German jokes, the ones that always sounded like prophecy because he never explained them. She had said, "In it, Papa," like a riddle, and her father had not laughed back. He had said, "Verena, your grandfather sewed our water into that book in 1944 because he had already lost it twice to the state, and he was not going to lose it a third time. You promise me, when you come back here for the funeral, you find that book before Reinhardt finds it." She had promised. And then she had driven back to Topeka, and she had not thought about it again until the night before the funeral, when she had woken at 3 in the morning with the words in her mouth like a coin. Find the book. The wind moved against the steel siding of the shed, and somewhere out past the cottonwoods, a meadow lark made the small, dry call it makes in November, and Verena Rothmeyer carried the ledger out into the cold, flat light of the Ellis County morning, and started the long walk back across the yard to the farmhouse. The brass corner guards cool against her forearm, the smell of stale wheat dust still in the cardigan of her sleeve, and the central question already alive in her chest. What had Conrad Rothmeyer sewn into the cover of that book in 1944? The farmhouse had the kind of silence that only comes to a Kansas farmhouse in the third week after a funeral. A silence that is not empty, but folded, like a quilt put away in a cedar chest, with a sprig of cedar inside it. Verena set the ledger on the oak farm table under the brass pendant lamp, and she did not open it yet. She put the kettle on the stove for coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window, looking east at the spire of St. Fidelis, 6 miles away across the flat, the limestone catching the new morning sun, and she counted in her head the number of generations of Rothmeyer women who had stood at this window and looked at that spire. Her great-grandmother Katharina, who had come over from Norca on the steamer in 1876, carrying her great-grandfather's mason apron and a bag of turkey red wheat seed sewn into the hem of her skirt. Her grandmother Magdalena, who had buried 2 children on the same April day in 1918 from the Spanish flu, and never wore color again. Her own mother, Magdalena II, who had died in 1996, of a stroke in this same kitchen with the bread still rising on the table. And now her, Verena, the 4th Magdalena in a way, because her middle name was Magdalena, though she had never used it. She had not come back to this table as the daughter who had left it. That girl had driven east on a scholarship and a borrowed $100 in the glove box, certain that Topeka would give her a cleaner life than the one that had stained her hands with wheat dust every July. The woman who returned was 53, divorced 11 years, carrying the habit of paying bills on the day they came because she still remembered the winter after her husband left, when the gas company put a red notice on the apartment door, and her son Micah stood beside her in the hallway, pretending not to read it. She had worked accounts payable for a hospital supply company for 18 years. She knew how paper disappeared inside systems that were supposed to preserve it. A purchase order misfiled under the wrong vendor could cost a nurse her gloves. A discharge form lost between floors could keep an old man in a bed one night too long. A deed lost in a courthouse basement could make a family poor for 3 generations, while everybody in an office said the record was the record. Her father had never asked her to come home during those years. He had sent envelopes instead, 5 $20 bills folded inside a church bulletin at Christmas, a grocery card tucked into a sympathy card when her marriage ended, a check for the exact cost of Micah's first set of tires mailed without a note. When she called and said, "Papa, I can pay you back," he always said the same thing. "Verena, wheat does not ask the rain to pay it back. It just grows when it can." She had not understood the mercy in that sentence until she was standing in the kitchen after his funeral, looking at the blue tin coffee pot and the worn place on the floor where his left boot had rested for half a century. The ledger on the table was not only a thing he had hidden from Reinhardt. It was the last bill her father had paid for her before he died, and this time the amount had not been written on a check. Micah had called from Wichita the night after the burial. He was 31 now, a lineman with hands broad as his grandfather's, and a wife due with their first child in February, and his voice had gone careful when he asked whether she wanted him to come back out. Verena had told him no. She had told him his crew needed him after the ice storm, and Anna needed him more, and she had stood in the kitchen holding the phone cord between 2 fingers while the empty house listened. He had said, "Mom, Grandpa told me once there was a book in the shed. He said if you found it, you would know what to do." She had asked when Anton had said that. Micah had said, "Last Easter, when we fixed the porch rail, he made me promise not to tell Reinhardt." Then he had gone quiet, in the way men go quiet when they hear themselves repeat the dead. Verena had looked through the dark window at the black square of the grain shed and had said, "I am going to find it in the morning." Micah had said, "Then call me when you do." She had not called him yet. She wanted to know first whether the book was a memory or a weapon. The kettle whistled. She poured the water over the grounds, in the blue tin pot, and waited. And then she sat down at the table with the cup at her right hand, and she opened the ledger book to the first page. The first page was an inventory, 1944. Anton Conrad Rothmeyer, age 6. Schoolbook reader 2. Coat blue mother, boots brown, 2 sizes too big. Wendelin Pfannenstiel's son outgrew. Confirmation in May with Father Clemens. Below that, her grandfather Conrad's handwriting, in pencil, very small. $12 to the parish. The pencil had gone soft and ghostly with time, but the small square letters were her father's letters because her father had learned to write from this man, and the handwriting was so close it stopped her breath. She turned the page. 1945. Conrad Rothmeyer, age 42. 320 acres dryland wheat. Yield 11 bushels per acre. Hailstorm, June 12th. Below that, in the same pencil, even smaller. The Smoky Hill went dry at the South Draw August 2nd. Water judge from Topeka came September. We kept our share. Verena's thumb found the small amber cross at her throat before she knew she had reached for it, and the cup of coffee was getting cold, and she had not taken a sip. She turned another page, and another, and another. The ledger was a year-by-year record of one man's life in wheat and water from 1944 to 1996, with a final page in her father's handwriting that read simply, "Papa Conrad died, March 4th, 1996, in his sleep, in the bed by the south window. The book is mine now. May the Lord keep it." She closed the ledger gently and laid both palms on the cover. The cover was where the weight was. She knew it now. She slid her fingertips along the inside of the front board, and there it was, a faint thickening, an unevenness where something had been folded flat and stitched in beneath the cloth. Her father had told her the truth. Conrad had sewn the water into the cover. Verena was just about to turn the book over to examine the back seam when she heard tires on the gravel of the lane. A truck door slammed. 2 truck doors. Voices. One she knew, one she did not. She rose, carried the ledger to the pantry, set it on the second shelf behind a row of mason jars of pickled beets her mother had put up in 1995, closed the pantry door, smoothed the front of her cardigan, pressed her thumb once against the amber cross at her throat, and walked to the front room to open the door for her cousin Reinhard Pfannenstiel. Reinhard filled the doorway. He always had. 6'1", broad-shouldered, the thickening middle of a man who had spent 30 years sitting in the manager's office of the Victoria Grain Co-op signing tickets. While other men loaded the trucks, the green seed company cap was pushed back the way he always wore it. The horseshoe mustache had gone iron gray in the years since she had last seen him at Easter dinner. Behind him on the porch board stood a stranger, a clean-shaven blond man in a charcoal soft-shell jacket and pressed khakis and polished boots that had never seen a feedlot. He had a black leather portfolio under his arm. Reinhardt said, "Verena, heard you were out at the place. Thought I would come by. Brought somebody. Wants to meet you." She did not move out of the doorway. She said, "Cousin Reinhardt, you did not call." Reinhardt smiled around his mustache, the way he smiled at farmers he was about to short on a moisture reading. "Family does not call, Verena. Family stops in. This here is Trent Halverson. Trent works for the water company out of Wichita. He has got an offer." Verena looked past him at the blond man, and the blond man smiled and held out a hand and said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, a pleasure, Halverson Agri-Water Consortium. We have been working with your cousin on the South Draw rights, and we just need a few minutes of your time." Verena did not shake his hand. She said, "Step in. I will put on more coffee." They came in. Reinhardt sat at the head of the table, where her father had sat for 54 years. The blond man sat at her father's right, where her mother had sat. Verena stayed standing at the stove with the blue tin pot. The kitchen had become a place she did not recognize because of the way these 2 men were sitting in it. She poured them coffee in 2 of her mother's stoneware cups, and she did not pour herself one. She turned to the table and stayed standing. Trent Halverson opened the black leather portfolio and laid out 3 documents fanned across the oak. He said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, I will keep this brief because I know this is a hard time. The Halverson Agri-Water Consortium has been consolidating senior surface water rights along the Smoky Hill Basin for the past 4 years. Your late father held the Rothmeyer file on a draw 2.5 miles southwest of here. Your cousin, as executor of the estate, has signed a letter of intent to transfer the water rights to our consortium in exchange for a one-time payment of $48,000. Conditional upon the heir, that is yourself, executing a quitclaim. We are prepared to close today." Verena looked at Reinhardt. Reinhardt did not look back at her. He was looking at the table. Halverson said, "The $48,000 is generous, Mrs. Rothmeyer. Most folks in your situation are getting 22, 28 at most." "We have done very well by your family," Verena said. "May I see the file?" Halverson slid the topmost document across the oak, and she lifted it without sitting. It was a 1-page summary of a Kansas Department of Agriculture water rights filing dated September 1962, listing the Rothmeyer draw at 55 acre-feet per year, junior priority, subject to consolidation under the Basin Compact. 55 acre-feet. Junior. Her father had said 3 weeks before he died, on the porch with his hands folded, "Conrad sealed our water in 1944, not 1962, 1944. Verena set the paper back down very carefully on the oak. She said, "Cousin Reinhardt, when did you sign the letter of intent?" Reinhardt's eyes came up, and they were the deep-set blue eyes of his own father, her uncle Wendelin, who had died of a heart attack at the wheel of a combine in 1981, with all of his sons still children. Reinhardt said, day after the funeral, "Verena," Halverson said, "and the heir's quitclaim is the last piece. We have a notary in the truck. We can close today." Verena pressed her thumb against the amber cross at her throat. She said, "Mr. Halverson, the Rothmeyer water is not 1962. The Rothmeyer water is 1944. There was a small silence, and the wind moved against the storm window above the sink. And Halverson smiled the kind of smile a man smiles when he has heard a sentence he was hoping not to hear. He said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, with respect, your father told you that story. It is a beautiful story. I have heard it from 12 families along this draw. But the state record is the state record, and the state record is 1962. Your cousin understands this. Your cousin has been managing the family business affairs for some years. He has signed. We need you to sign." Verena looked at Reinhardt. Reinhardt looked at the table. Verena said, "I will need a few days." Halverson said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, the offer expires Friday. After Friday, the consortium moves to consolidate under the Basin Compact, and the Rothmeyer draw transfers at adjudicated value, which last year was 12,000. Today is Tuesday." Verena said, "I will let myself think on it until Friday." Reinhardt stood up. He set his plain green farm supply cap back on his head and adjusted the brim with 2 fingers, and he said, "Verena, you always were stubborn like your mother. Think hard. Do not embarrass us." The 2 men walked out of her father's kitchen, and the storm door slapped shut behind them, and the truck started, and the gravel of the lane crunched under the tires, and the dust settled, and Verena Rothmeyer stood at the table with the coffee cups going cold and the central question burning in her chest. She turned to the pantry, and she took the ledger book down from behind the pickled beets, and she carried it back to the table, and she sat down. If old family papers have ever changed how you saw home, subscribe now. These sealed truths belong to people like us. The pantry door clicked shut behind her, and the kitchen became a workshop. She pulled the curtain down over the east window, not because anyone could see her from the lane, but because the act made the room smaller and steadier. She washed her hands at the sink with yellow soap until the wheat dust left her knuckles and the cold water made her fingers ache. Then she dried them on her mother's flour sack towel, the one with blue embroidery along the edge, and set 3 things beside the ledger: the bone-handled pocket knife, a saucer for the cut thread, and her father's magnifying glass from the drawer where he kept canceled checks. The magnifying glass had a chip on the rim from the year Micah dropped it on the porch boards at age 7. Anton had not scolded him then. He had picked it up, held it to the sun, and said, "See, boy, even cracked glass can still show a man where the line is." She turned the ledger so the spine faced her. The cloth had a dry, waxy feel under her fingertips, not like ordinary book cloth, but like the feed sacks her grandmother had saved under the stairs. Along the inside front board, the stitches were nearly the same color as the cover, black thread gone brown, where oil from hands had darkened it. But 4 stitches near the middle were lighter, newer. Not new, but not 1944 either. Magdalena's stitches, if the ledger entry was true. Verena put her thumb beside them and saw how the thread crossed itself twice in a neat little repair that no man in this family would have made. Her grandmother had sewn clothes for 9 children and altar linens for Saint Fidelis until cataracts clouded both eyes. Of course she would have hidden a deed with the same hand that mended a collar. Of course the proof would enter the future through a woman's needle. For a moment Verena did not cut. The house made its small daytime noises around her. The refrigerator motor clicked on and off. A fly bumped once against the kitchen window and then went still. Far away on Old 40, a grain truck downshifted, and the sound came thin across the stubble. She set her left palm on the ledger cover, and the raised shape pressed back beneath the cloth. Not a packet of money, not a photograph. A folded paper, long and stiff, with one corner thicker where wax would be. Her father's sentence returned whole. "The water is in the book, not on it. In it," she said aloud. "All right, Papa, I am opening it now." She laid the ledger flat on the oak and turned it over and ran her thumb along the back seam of the cloth cover, and the thickening was there too, but smaller. The front cover was where the weight was. She took her father's bone-handled pocket knife from the second drawer, and she opened it, and she rested the tip of the blade against the inside of the front cover, where the cloth had been re-sewn. Her hand was steady. Her grandfather Conrad's small square pencil letters on the first page of the ledger were the same shape as her own handwriting, and their pressure seemed to rise under the pad of her thumb. She pressed the blade into the threads. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 3. The cloth gave with a soft, dry whisper that sounded the way old promises sound when they are finally being kept. She turned back the flap of cloth, and there it was. A single folded paper, foolscap, the folds gone yellow at the creases, the official wax seal in the lower right corner cracked, but still legible, the date in copperplate at the top. State of Kansas Department of Agriculture, Division of Water Resources, Certificate of Senior Appropriation, number 743/44, dated August 14th, 1944. Granted to Conrad Anton Rothmeyer of Ellis County, Section 12, Township 14, South, Range 17 West, 240 acre-feet per year of surface water from the south draw of the Smoky Hill River. Priority date August 14th, 1944. In perpetuity, transferable only by signed instrument of the holder of record. 240 acre-feet, not 55. Senior priority 1944, not junior 1962. Verena held the paper in both hands, and the morning sun through the kitchen window came across the oak table and laid a long, bright bar across the wax seal, and she could not see the seal for the bright bar, and she had to turn the paper slightly, and there it was again, the cracked red wax with the state emblem stamped into it, and the impression of the deputy commissioner's signet ring beside the wax, an actual physical impression in the paper that no scanner had ever captured. Verena Rothmeyer laughed once, the small, dry laugh of a woman who has spent 4 hours in the cold of a grain shed and has come back into the warmth and found that the warmth was real. Then she folded the deed back up, folded it once on the old creases, slid it inside the front of her cardigan against her ribs, and she lifted the telephone from the wall and she dialed the number she had not dialed in 22 years. Hans Dreiling answered on the second ring. He said, "Dreiling and Carlin, attorneys, this is Hans." She said, "Mr. Dreiling, it is Verena Rothmeyer, Anton Rothmeyer's daughter." There was a small silence on the line, and then Hans Dreiling said, "Verena, your father told me last spring you would call. Are you at the farmhouse?" She said, "Yes." He said, "How soon can you be in Hayes?" She said 40 minutes. He said, come now, bring the book. Verena said, how did you know about the book? Hans Dreiling laughed the small dry laugh of an old country lawyer who has spent 50 years watching the same families lose the same fights. He said, Verena, I told your grandfather what to do with that book in 1985. Bring it. The drive to Hayes took 38 minutes on Old 40. The wheat stubble fields gone the color of saddle leather under the cold sun. The spire of St. Fidelis sliding past on her left at the 4-mile mark. The white grain elevators of the Victoria Co-op standing along the highway like priests with their hands folded. She kept her right hand pressed against the front of her cardigan the whole way. Her palm pressed the folded foolscap against her ribs through the cotton of her blouse. Her grandfather Conrad's wax seal firm beneath her hand. She parked in front of the limestone facade of the Dreiling and Carlin offices on Main Street in Hayes at 23 minutes past 10, and she climbed the worn marble steps under the painted gilt lettering above the door, and she pushed open the heavy oak door, and the bell above it jangled the same way it had jangled when she was 19 years old, and had come here with her father to sign the papers on her first car. Hans Dreiling stood in the doorway of his back office. He was 70 now. The thinning white hair was combed straight back the same way her father had combed his, and the wire-rimmed bifocals had slid halfway down the long, thin nose, and the maroon knit tie was the same maroon knit tie he had worn at her wedding in 1992. The gold pocket watch chain still crossed the brown tweed vest. He held out both hands. He said, Verena, come in. Sit down. The back office had not changed in any way she could measure. 2 walls of bound Kansas statutes. 1 wall of dark walnut filing cabinets. A green-shaded banker's lamp on the desk. A framed photograph of Hans's late wife, Friederike, beside the inkwell. Hans sat down behind the desk and folded his hands on the green blotter, and he said, You found it. She opened the front of her cardigan and drew out the folded foolscap, and she set it on the green blotter. Hans Dreiling looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he reached into the breast pocket of the tweed jacket and he took out the gold pocket watch, and he laid it on the blotter beside the deed, and he said, 41 years ago this June, your grandfather Conrad walked into this office with a brown paper sack under his arm, and he laid it on this same desk. The sack contained that deed, the August 1944 senior appropriation, 240 acre-feet from the south draw of the Smoky Hill in perpetuity. Your grandfather said to me, Hans, the state filed this deed for me in August of 1944, and the county lost the working file before 1962, and after that they came out here in a county truck, and they told my wife I had never filed it, and they offered me a junior 1962 priority on 110 acre-feet instead. I took the junior. I signed because I did not have a copy. But last week I cleaned out the parish basement under St. Fidelis, and I found the original. Hans, what do I do? And I told him, Conrad, take this deed home, and you sew it into the cover of your wheat scale book, and you keep that book on the second shelf of your office, in the grain shed, and you tell your son, and your son tells his son, and his son tells his daughter, and you do not produce this deed until somebody from a water consolidation company knocks on the front door with a quitclaim and a notary. And Conrad said, Hans, you think a day like that will come? And I said, Conrad, a day like that always comes. Hans Dreiling fell silent. The green-shaded banker's lamp made a small, soft circle of light on the blotter, and the deed lay in the circle. And Verena said nothing, because she could not say anything. Hans said, "Before we talk about Halvorsen, tell me exactly how you found it. Do not make it pretty. Make it accurate." Verena told him about the rusted padlock, the third drawer fighting her hand, the brass needle stopping at 4 pounds 11 ounces, the pantry shelf behind the pickled beets, Reinhardt at the door with the stranger behind him, and the way the stranger had laid the quitclaim across her mother's oak table. Hans did not interrupt. He took a yellow legal pad from the drawer and wrote with a fountain pen so old the black hard rubber had gone brown at the edges. When she said the words 48,000, his pen stopped. He looked over the rims of his bifocals and said, "They used the grief window." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means they came before the estate had settled, before the heir had slept, before the house had learned the shape of being empty. It is an old tactic. It works because people will sign almost anything if the coffee is still in the funeral pot." Verena put both hands flat on her knees, under the desk, where he could not see them. She said, "I almost asked him for the pen." Hans capped the fountain pen and laid it carefully beside the legal pad. He said, "But you did not." She said, "Because Papa said the water was in the book." Hans leaned back in his chair and the springs creaked beneath the tweed. He said, "That is your first turning, Verena. You stopped being the daughter cleaning out a farm and became the holder of a question. Most families lose their land between those two roles because nobody tells them when the change has happened. Your father told you." She said, "He told me too late." Hans shook his head once. "He told you before the men with the portfolio got your signature. In my profession, that counts as early." Hans said, "Halvorsen Agriwater came to you this morning. Did they not?" She said, "This morning, with Reinhardt, $48,000, conditional on a quitclaim." Hans nodded once. He said, "They have been working the basin for 4 years. They have absorbed 68 families. Every one of those families had a 1962 junior file because the state lost the senior originals between 1944 and 1962 in 3 different basement floods. The Halvorsen model is to consolidate the junior files and then claim adjudicated transfer on the senior files that nobody can produce." "You can produce," she said. "What do I do now?" Hans Streiling lifted the deed gently, the way a priest lifts a host. He turned it over twice. He examined the cracked red wax. He examined the impression of the deputy commissioner's signet ring. He examined the watermark in the foolscap. He said, "This is the original. Cracked seal, signet impression, deputy commissioner's counter-signature in pencil, along the lower margin, watermark of the Kansas paper mill in Atchison, August 1944 batch. Notarized in the recorder's office in Topeka, the day after issuance. This is the original of the original." He laid it down again. He said, "Verena, you walk this deed across the street to the Ellis County Register of Deeds tomorrow morning at 9, and you ask for Teresa Schoenfeld personally, and you tell her Hans Drehling sent you. You file a certified copy in the public record. The minute that copy enters the public record, the Halvorsen letter of intent becomes legally void because your cousin signed as executor over a property right that belongs to a senior holder who is still living. That senior holder is you, by inheritance. Reinhardt's signature on the letter of intent has no effect because Reinhardt never had authority to transfer the senior right in the first place. The senior right was sealed inside that ledger, and the ledger was your inheritance, not the estate's. Your grandfather sewed it into the cover precisely so that Reinhardt could not transfer it on a Tuesday morning before you found out." Verena pressed her thumb against the amber cross at her throat. She said, Hans, will Reinhardt understand? Reinhardt. Hans Dreiling smiled the small, dry smile of a country lawyer who has known 3 generations of Pfannenstiels and 4 generations of Rothmeyers. He said, Verena, Reinhardt will not understand. Reinhardt will be angry. Reinhardt will be loud. Reinhardt will tell you you are embarrassing the family. You will produce the deed. Reinhardt will go home, and he will sit on his porch and he will think for a long time. And at the end of that long time, he will understand. But you cannot make him understand before then. That is what understanding requires. Time, Verena said, and Halverson. Hans said, Halverson will threaten litigation. Halverson will not file. Halverson never files when the senior original surfaces. Halverson disappears. I have seen it twice. In Sherman County in 2021. In Trego County in 2022. The original surfaces, Halverson disappears. The family keeps the water. He paused. He said, 240 acre-feet. At present market, Verena is worth about $1,140,000 in standing value. Not in cash, in standing value. The land is worth what the land is worth, but the water on the land is worth $1,000,001. The Halverson offer was 4 cents on the dollar. Verena did not say anything. She picked up the deed and refolded it on the old creases and slid it back inside the front of her cardigan against her ribs, the cracked wax seal pressing against her sternum where the small amber cross also pressed. She said, Mr. Dreiling, thank you. Hans Dreiling stood up. He said, Verena, one more thing. When Reinhardt comes back to the farmhouse tomorrow evening, and he will, you let him come in. You sit him down at the same table where he sat this morning. You pour him coffee. You produce the deed. You let him say what he is going to say. You do not raise your voice. You are your father's daughter, and that means you do not raise your voice. The truth will raise its voice for you, she said. Yes, sir. She drove back to the farmhouse along Old 40, with the late autumn sun coming over her left shoulder and the wheat stubble running away to the south for 16 miles, and the spire of St. Fidelis catching the light again on the way home. And when she pulled into the gravel lane at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she sat for a long minute in the cold cab of the truck, with her hands on the wheel, and she let herself cry for the first time since the burial. Not from grief, from the other thing, the thing that comes after grief and before joy and has no proper name. She wiped her face with the cuff of the rust-brown cardigan, and she got out of the truck, and she carried the ledger back inside, and she set it on the table, and she put on a fresh pot of coffee. The afternoon went long. She read through the ledger page by page, from 1944 to 1996, 52 years of her grandfather's life and her father's life in pencil and ink. The small square handwriting that was her own handwriting. The rainfalls and the hailstorms and the yields and the funeral expenses and the parish tithes and the names of every Pfannenstiel and Brungart and Wassinger and Schoenfeld and Dreiling who had ever loaned this family a hand or borrowed one back. She read the entry for the day her grandfather had received the senior appropriation in 1944. August 14th, 1944. 240 acre-feet, perpetual, south draw. The Lord has heard. She read the entry for the day in 1962 when the state had come out and told Magdalena that Conrad had never filed. September 2nd, 1962. They came with a county truck. They said I never filed. I signed for 110 Junior because Magdalena was crying and the boys were watching. I have signed, but I have not lost. The original is on the second shelf of the parish basement in a brown sack. I will go for it tomorrow. May the Lord forgive me for signing when I had not lost. She read the entry for the day Conrad had walked into Hans Dreiling's office with the brown paper sack in 1985. June 17th, 1985. Hans says sew it into the cover. I will sew it tonight. Magdalena says she will sew the stitches because her hands are steadier than mine now. The Lord be praised for steady hands. She read the entry for the day her grandfather had died, in her father's handwriting now, in pencil, very small. March 4th, 1996. Papa Conrad died in his sleep, in the bed by the south window. The book is mine now. May the Lord keep it. She closed the ledger. She put it back on the table. She stood at the kitchen window, and she looked at the spire of St. Fidelis 6 miles east across the flat, and she watched the light go off it in the early evening as the sun dropped down toward the west fence line. And she thought about her grandfather Conrad Rothmeyer, who had sewn a deed into a ledger in 1944 because he had already lost his water twice to a state that could not keep track of its own paper. And she thought about her father, Anton Rothmeyer, who had carried that ledger from his father's grain shed to his own grain shed in 1996 and had kept it there on the second shelf for 29 years without ever cutting the stitches because his father had told him not to until somebody came down the lane with a quitclaim. And she thought about herself, fourth-generation daughter, 53 years old, standing in a kitchen in Ellis County, Kansas, with her grandfather's wax seal pressing against her sternum through the cotton of an ivory blouse. The light moved off the spire, and the spire went gray, and then dark, and the wind in the cottonwoods made the small, dry sound it makes in late autumn, and she said aloud to the empty kitchen, "Papa, I found it." Then she sat down at the oak table, and she ate the cold supper she had brought in from town that morning, a slice of summer sausage and a roll and a wedge of cheddar and a pickled beet from her mother's jar, and she drank a small glass of beer from her father's last bottle of local lager in the icebox, and she went to bed in her old bedroom upstairs, under the eaves with the deed folded once, and laid flat under her pillow beside the amber cross, which she always took off at night. Before Reinhardt came back, the house gave her one last hour without witnesses. Verena spent it putting things where they belonged, not because the room needed tidying, but because her hands needed work that did not tremble. She washed the supper plate and dried it and set it in the cupboard. She wiped the oak table twice, once with a damp cloth and once with the heel of her palm, following the grain until the old scratches showed like little pale roads. She moved Reinhardt's chair back 6 inches from the head of the table and then moved it forward again. If he was going to sit where Anton had sat, he would sit close enough to see the seal. She called Micah at 4:30. He answered from a truck cab with wind loud around him. She said, "I found it." He did not ask what. He said, "Is it bad?" She looked at the ledger on the table, at the certified copy folded inside the front cover, at the original now resting downtown in the public file, where no cousin and no consortium could carry it off. She said, "It is heavy." He said, "Do you want me there?" She looked toward the lane, empty in the gray light. For 31 years she had tried to keep her son from standing between her and a hard thing. He was a grown man now, and the old habit rose in her like a reflex. "No," she almost said. Then she pressed the amber cross and made herself answer differently. "I want you to know where the book is. If anything happens, it is on the second shelf of the grain shed office in a new oilcloth cover, and Teresa Schoenfeld has the original at the courthouse." Micah was quiet. Then he said, "That sounds like Grandpa." She said, "It sounds like all of them." She told him about the 1944 certificate, the 1948 lost mark, the false junior file, the $48,000 offer, and the $1,140,000 Hans had called standing value. Micah swore once under his breath and then apologized, though she had heard worse from him in high school. She said, "Do not come tonight. Anna needs you home before dark. Reinhardt is coming by himself." Micah said, "Mom, are you sure?" She looked at the coffee cups lined on the counter and heard Hans's sentence. "The truth will raise its voice for you." She said, "I am sure enough." Then, because she had learned one thing in the last 2 days about saying what the dead had left unsaid, she added, "Your grandfather trusted you too. He told you enough to keep me looking." Micah breathed out hard, and the wind in the phone swallowed whatever he said first. Then his voice came back plain. "Call me when he leaves." After she hung up, Verena took the amber cross from her throat and laid it beside the ledger. Without it, the skin at her collar seemed strangely light, as if some small weight she had carried since confirmation had been removed for judgment. Her mother had given her the cross at 13 and said, "You do not wear this because God forgets where you are. You wear it because you forget." Verena turned it once in the lamplight. The amber held a trapped fleck of something dark at its center, a seed or a bark shaving or a wing from some old forest no one could name. She put it back on and fastened the clasp. Then she opened the front door and looked down the gravel lane toward the west, where the sun had dropped behind the cottonwoods and every rut held a narrow line of copper light. A truck appeared at the far cattle guard. One truck, not two. The cousin came back at 6 o'clock the next evening. She had spent the morning at the Ellis County Courthouse on Main Street in Hayes. She had walked into the Register of Deeds office at 9 o'clock sharp, the way Hans Dreiling had told her to. She had asked for Teresa Schoenfeld personally. Teresa Schoenfeld had come out from the back office, and Teresa Schoenfeld was 48 years old. Light brown, shoulder-length hair pulled back in a low ponytail. Hazel eyes behind small black frame glasses. Soft cranberry cardigan over a white blouse with a pointed collar. And Teresa Schoenfeld had taken one look at the fool's cap and at the cracked red wax seal, and she had said quietly, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, step into my office." They had spent 2 hours together with the deed laid flat on the polished oak counter under the single tall west window of the Register of Deeds office, the hard limestone light coming across the page and lighting the wax. Teresa had brought out the 1944 Master Index from the back room, and she had laid it open beside the deed, and she had run her finger down the column of August 1944 senior filings, and she had stopped at the line that read, "Rothmeyer, Conrad Anton, 743/44, August 14th, 1944, Smoky Hill South Draw, 240AF Perpetual, filed." And next to that line in pencil, in a hand that was not the original clerk's, was the word lost and a date and a set of initials. December 3rd, 1948. CJW. Teresa had looked at the pencil annotation for a long minute, and then she had laid her own finger gently next to the pencil annotation, and she had said Mrs. Rothmeyer. The original was filed in 1944. The state lost the file in 1948. A clerk named C.J. Whitcomb wrote "lost" next to the line in 1948 in pencil. "Your grandfather's deed has been a missing original file in this office for 77 years. We have been carrying the line in the master index that whole time. We just never had the paper," Verena said. "You have it now." Teresa Schoenfeld smiled, the small, steady smile of a Register of Deeds chief clerk who has spent half her life trying to put paper back where paper belongs. She said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, with your permission, I am going to issue a certified copy of this deed within the hour. I am going to enter the certification into the public record at noon today. And I am going to send a notice by certified mail to the Halverson Agri-Water Consortium in Wichita and to Reinhard Pfannenstiel of Victoria, notifying both parties that the Rothmeyer Sr. 1944 appropriation has been reattached to its original certificate. The 1962 Junior file becomes void by operation of law because Junior cannot exist on a draw where Senior already does. Your land's water becomes yours again retroactively to 1944. Verena said, "Yes." Teresa did not stand immediately. She took a clean sheet of archival paper from a drawer and set it beside the deed, then wrote 3 lines in a square clerk's hand. Original certificate presented by heir. Seal intact. Index line retained since filing. She turned the paper toward Verena and tapped the blank space at the bottom. "Mrs. Rothmeyer, before I certify this, I want you to understand what I am certifying. I am not making your family's story true. I am saying the public record already contained the place where the truth belonged, and your grandfather's paper fits that place exactly. That distinction matters when the company lawyer calls me." Verena looked at the master index again. The page was larger than a church Bible, bound in cracked black leather, its corners rubbed gray by hands that had been dead for 50 years. Names ran down the column in ink that had browned, but not vanished. Pfeiffer, Wassinger, Rothmeyer, Brungart. Each line held a farm, a draw, a year, a priority, a piece of weather turned into law. The word lost beside her grandfather's line had seemed cruel when she first saw it. Now it looked like a hand reaching up from under silt. She said, "How many more have that mark?" Teresa closed her lips and looked toward the shelves in the back room. "More than I can count without staying late for a month." She lowered her voice. The 1948 flood came through the basement window wells. They saved the marriage books first, then the probate books, then the land books. Water rights were in loose files. Some were carried upstairs in peach crates. Some were dried on radiators. Some were copied wrong. Some were never copied at all. Your grandfather's index line survived because the master book was already on the 2nd floor. Verena said, "Then Halverson knows there are more." Teresa's eyes moved from the index to the deed. Yes. She took off her black frame glasses and wiped one lens with the edge of her cardigan. "That is why they want quitclaims. A quitclaim does not ask what the family owns. It asks what the family is willing to stop asking about. If they get enough signatures, the absence becomes convenient." She put the glasses back on. "Your father must have known that," Verena said. "He knew enough to tell me where to look." Teresa nodded. "Then he did his duty." "Now we do ours." A young deputy clerk opened the back door carrying a stack of plat maps and stopped when she saw the fool's cap on the counter. Teresa said, "Elise, lock the front door for 15 minutes and tell anyone waiting that we are certifying a senior original." The young woman looked once at the red wax seal, and her face changed, not dramatic, not frightened, but sharpened by recognition. "Yes, ma'am." The latch clicked at the front of the office. For the first time since Verena had found the ledger, a public room rearranged itself around the deed. Not around Reinhardt, not around Halverson. Around the paper Conrad had hidden because paper, once seen by the right witness, could make powerful men wait outside a locked door. Teresa brought out a flatbed scanner, cotton gloves, a linen weight, and a small brass seal press with Ellis County curved along the rim. She did each step slowly enough for Verena to follow. First the scan, then the copy, then the certification stamp, then the embossing, then the red ribbon through the corner holes, then the clerk's signature in blue ink, because blue proved an original signature, and black could vanish into a photocopy. She spoke as she worked. One certified copy for you, one for your lawyer, one notice copy for the State Water Office. Original into the master file under 743/44. Cross-reference to the false 1962 junior file. Cancellation notice to Halverson. Notice to executor. She looked up. That is the order. Do not let anyone persuade you there is a faster one. Verena watched the embossed county seal rise under Teresa's hand. It was not as beautiful as the cracked red wax. It was not old, but it was public, current, awake. Her shoulders lowered by half an inch. The deed had stopped being a secret pressed against her ribs and become a record other people had to answer. She thought of Halverson's portfolio on her mother's table, black and thin and confident, and of how small it would look under this courthouse window once the certified notice reached Wichita. For the first time, the company had to answer a woman who had paper older than its letterhead, older than its office lease, older than every polite threat it had carried down a gravel lane in a clean black portfolio. Teresa slid the first certified copy across the counter, and Verena did not take it at once. She looked at the clerk's hand beside it, the light freckles across the wrist, the plain gold wedding band, the short practical nails. She said, "Mrs. Schoenfeld, did you know my father?" Teresa said, "He came in every December to check the parish cemetery easements. He always brought peppernuts in a coffee tin. He never once asked for special treatment." Verena touched the raised seal with 2 fingers. "That sounds like him," Teresa said. "It does." Teresa stood up. She walked to the certified copy machine in the corner of the back room, and she made 3 copies. She certified each one with the embossed seal of the Ellis County Register of Deeds and her own signature. She returned to the counter, and she handed Verena 2 copies, and she said, "Keep one in the ledger. Keep one in a safe deposit box at the Victoria State Bank. The original stays here in the master file. As of 12 o'clock noon today, the south draw of the Smoky Hill is yours." Verena said, "Mrs. Schoenfeld, thank you." Teresa said, "Mrs. Rothmeyer, tell your cousin to come see me when he is ready to apologize. I will be at this counter." Verena drove home, and she stopped at the cemetery beside St. Fidelis on the way, and she stood for 10 minutes at her father's fresh stone and her grandfather's older stone, and her grandmother's older still and her great-grandmother's worn limestone marker from 1923. And she did not say anything, because nothing in her was empty enough yet to be filled with words. She drove the last 6 miles to the farmhouse, and she put the certified copy of the deed in the front cover of the ledger, and she put the ledger on the oak table, and she put the kettle on. The truck came down the lane at 6. 1 truck this time. Reinhardt alone. He came up the porch steps slowly. He did not knock. He let himself in the way family does, and he stood in the front room with the plain green farm supply cap pulled lower over his eyes than it had been the day before, and the horseshoe mustache pulled tight at the corners, and the deep-set blue eyes of his father Wendelin gone hard. He said, "Verena, I got a certified letter this afternoon." Verena said, "Sit down, Cousin Reinhardt." I made coffee. Reinhardt did not sit. He said, "You went around me." She said, "Cousin, sit down." He stood for another long moment with his hands at his sides, and then he sat down at the head of the table where her father had sat for 54 years. She poured him coffee in her mother's stoneware cup. She set the cup at his right hand. She sat down across the corner from him in the chair her mother had sat in, and she laid the certified copy of the deed on the oak between them. She did not say anything. Reinhardt looked at the deed for a long time without picking it up. The brass pendant lamp made a small, steady circle of light on the oak. The wind moved against the storm window. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods, a meadowlark made its small, dry, late autumn call. Reinhardt said, $48,000, Verena. She said, $1,000,001, cousin. He looked up at her. She said, Hans Dreiling handled Grandpa Conrad's recovery of the original deed in 1985. The state lost the file in 1948. Grandpa Conrad found it in the basement of the parish in 1985. He sewed it into the cover of the wheat scale ledger that same year. Papa kept it there for 29 years. I found it yesterday morning. I filed the certified copy in the Register of Deeds office at noon today. The Halverson letter of intent is void by operation of law as of noon today. The south draw of the Smoky Hill is mine. Reinhardt did not speak for a long time. The coffee in his cup went cold. The light through the storm window moved across the table and then off the table and onto the painted yellow plaster of the wall, and then off the wall, and the kitchen went gray. Reinhardt said, I did not know, Verena. About the senior file. I thought we were a junior. My father said we were a junior. He said it in 1979 when Wendelin had his heart attack, and we settled Wendelin's estate. He said the Rothmeyer line was always a junior. I repeated it again at your father's funeral. I thought Halverson was doing us a favor. I thought 48 was good money for junior water. She said, I know, cousin. Reinhardt's eyes filled. He did not cry. He was a 60-year-old Volga German man, and Volga German men did not cry at kitchen tables. But his eyes filled, and he stared at the deed on the oak, and he said, Anton always knew. Anton sat in this kitchen 10,000 times, and he always knew, and he never told me. She said he told me 3 weeks before he died. He told me to find the book before you signed. He told me you would sign because you had never understood that water and land are different. He was not blaming you, cousin. He was just telling me where the book was. Reinhardt said, Verena, I have signed letters of intent on 12 other water rights this year. Pfeiffer's Draw, Wasinger's Draw, the Brungart Draw south of Walker, the Klaus Draw at the section line. 48,000. 48,000. I have walked into 12 farmhouses with Halverson, and I have sat at 12 kitchen tables, and I have helped him buy out junior water at 4 cents on the dollar from women just like you and old men who could not stand up to him. And every one of those families thought they were junior because the state lost the senior files in the 1948 flood. And I never thought to ask. Verena said, Cousin Reinhardt. Teresa Schoenfeld said she will be at the Register of Deeds counter tomorrow morning. She said you should come see her. Reinhardt put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for a long minute. Then he stood up. He set the plain green farm supply cap straight on his head. He took the cold coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it out and set it upside down on the dish rack the way he had been taught to do at this same sink when he was 8 years old and his mother Hilda had been alive. He walked to the front door. He paused with his hand on the storm door. He said, Verena. She said, yes, cousin. He said, tomorrow morning, Teresa Schoenfeld will see me at 9 o'clock. Tomorrow afternoon, Hans Dreiling will see me at 1. The day after tomorrow, I will drive down to Pfeiffer's place, and I will tell Wilma Pfeiffer what I did, and then I will drive to Wassinger's, and then to the Brungards, and then to the Klauses. 12 farmhouses. I am going to 12 farmhouses. I am going to tell every one of them that the state lost their senior file in the 1948 flood, and that the senior is still there in the master index waiting to be reattached. I am going to drive Halverson out of the basin in 12 weeks. Verena said, Cousin Reinhardt. He said, I do not deserve your forgiveness yet, Verena, but I am going to earn it. She said, You always could. He went out. The storm door slapped shut behind him. The truck started. The gravel of the lane crunched under the tires. The dust settled. Verena Rothmeyer stood at the oak table in the kitchen of the farmhouse her great-grandmother Katharina had walked into in 1876 with a bag of turkey red wheat seed sewn into the hem of her skirt, and she pressed her thumb against the small amber cross at her throat, and she looked down at the certified copy of the 1944 water deed on the oak under the brass pendant lamp, and the cracked official red wax seal pressed through the cotton of her blouse, where the original lay folded back inside the front cover of the wheat scale ledger. And she let herself laugh once more, the small, dry laugh of a woman who has come home and found that home was still home. That night, after Reinhardt's taillights vanished beyond the cottonwoods, Verena did not move for several minutes. The certified copy remained on the table. The coffee cup he had rinsed stood upside down in the rack, a small domestic proof that he had entered angry and left ashamed enough to remember his mother's training. She called Micah and told him only the facts at first. Reinhardt had come alone. Reinhardt had read the deed. Reinhardt was going to the courthouse at 9. Micah listened without interrupting. Then he said, Did he apologize? Verena looked at the storm door, still rattling a little in the wind. She said, Not with the word. He said, Did you need the word? She thought of Reinhardt carrying the cup to the sink, of his hand paused on the storm door latch, of the 12 farmhouses named one by one. She said, No, not tonight. She slept downstairs in her father's recliner, with the ledger on the table, where she could see it if she opened her eyes. At 2 in the morning, the wind shifted north, and the whole farmhouse tightened around its nails. She woke once and saw moonlight lying across the oak, the ledger a black rectangle inside it, and for half a breath she saw not the book, but the chain of hands that had brought it there. Conrad receiving the certificate in 1944, while his son was 6. Magdalena sewing the stitches in 1985, while cataracts blurred the needle. Anton carrying the book after the funeral in 1996. Micah hearing enough at Easter to keep the promise alive. Herself cutting the thread because the men at the table had mistaken silence for surrender. She got up before dawn, made coffee, and wrote one sentence on the first blank page after her father's last entry. October 24th. I found it. The water is home. The Halverson Agri-Water Consortium pulled out of the Ellis County Basin within 9 weeks. They did not file litigation. Hans Dreiling had been right about that. They simply disappeared. Their Wichita office closed in February. Their letters of intent on 12 other senior-eligible draws were declared void by operation of law, as the original 1944 senior files began to surface in basements and ledgers and parish vestries and grain sheds across Ellis County and Rush County and Trego County and Sherman County. Over the next year, Reinhardt Pfannenstiel made good on his word. He drove the 12 farmhouses in 12 weeks, and he sat at 12 kitchen tables, and he told 12 families what he had done and what he was going to do to undo it. Wilma Pfeiffer cried. Old Anselm Wasinger laughed. The Brungart brothers thanked him quietly. The Klaus widow opened a bottle of her late husband's homemade plum wine, and the two of them sat on the front porch and drank it slowly while the sun went down. Reinhardt resigned as manager of the Victoria Grain Co-op at the end of the first quarter. He went back to farming his own ground on the section south of Catherine. He came to the Rothmeyer place for Easter dinner the following spring, and he sat at the head of the oak table where his uncle Anton had sat for 54 years. And he said the grace, and he wept once into his folded hands. When he came to the part of the grace that said, "Lord, we thank you for those who came before us," and Verena Rothmeyer sat in her mother's chair at his right hand, and she let him weep, and she did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. The water of the south draw of the Smoky Hill ran under the Rothmeyer ground for another year, and the wheat came in, and the wheat came in, and the parish ledger of St. Fidelis kept its small square pencil entries the way it had kept them for 150 years. The wheat scale ledger went back to the second shelf of the grain shed in a new oilcloth cover that Verena had sewn herself one Sunday afternoon with her mother's old steel needle and a length of waxed linen thread. The certified copy folded inside, the original on file with Teresa Schoenfeld at the Ellis County Register of Deeds office, and the small amber cross still at her throat. If this story carried you the way Verena carried that ledger out of her father's grain shed, leave a comment with the place your own family came from, and subscribe so the next sealed deed finds you when it is ready to be opened. The truth had finally come home.